I would invite you to come to Special Collections and see the exhibit when we're concluded. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Is the sound all right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'd like to begin by saying that today's presentation is not really a standalone presentation, but a talk that is linked to our exhibit, Viva Mexico, a comic book history of Mexico, which is currently on view in Special Collections through August. The comics in that exhibit are from my personal collection, from which I've selected some of my favorite items to highlight different themes and patterns in the history of Mexican comics. At that exhibit, you will see comics about Mexican religion, Mexican communism, famous heroes like Pancho Villa, comics depicting key themes from Mexico's history, such as the conquest of Mexico, the disappearance of the 43 students in Ayotzinapa last September, Mexican immigration, Mexican westerns, and other topics. Check it out. It's not a lousy way to spend 15 or 20 minutes. I would like to thank the UTA Library for generously offering to host this exhibit and for working with me to make it possible and available to all of you and the rest of the UT Arlington community. We have worked, as Brenda said, very hard and many long nights to make this happen, and I really appreciate the support and efforts of Dean Bickle, Brenda McClurkin, Evelyn Barker, Kathy Spitzenberger, Ben Huseman. I also appreciate Erin O'Malley, who helped me think about this exhibit over a year ago and helped get it in the schedule so that we could make it happen this semester. So I really appreciate that. I also want to thank Johnny Robertson and his team of designers for taking my original layout and making it come alive. So please check out the exhibit. So why do Mexican comic books matter? That is probably the simplest and most important question. So let's tackle it first. If we were just hanging out at the Starbucks in the Student Center, and I was feeling a lot more relaxed than I am right now, I might just say, are you kidding me? They're cool. They're beautiful. Just go to Special Collections and look at the exhibit. It seems like a light answer, an insubstantial one, but I don't believe it is. Mexican comic books are aesthetic objects. They are examples of Mexican pop art. Some of them are the kind of items that you would be proud to reproduce and frame and put on the wall of your living room. On a more academic level, however, Mexican comic books matter because they are a cultural object that can teach us something about Mexican history and Mexican taste. When I say taste, I refer to the taste for certain kinds of characters, the taste for certain kinds of plots, the taste for certain kinds of settings, the taste for certain kinds of mood and certain kinds of cultural messages. Unlike the case of Mexican literature, for example, comics are not circumscribed to a small sector of the population, but are a true mass phenomenon. Mexican comics are, in short, a way to tell the story of some of the formulas that the Mexican people have had for feeling, desiring, and thinking about certain topics. Today's presentation will not be, in a strict sense, a chronological history of Mexico or the comic book arts of Mexico. Rather, what I want to do is talk about three frameworks that are useful for understanding the history of comic books in Mexico. I want to take on the topic of ways of talking about the history of Mexican comic books. And the first frame relates to how comic books relate to broader historical questions in cultural history. In other words, how the rise of comic books in the 20th century represents a watershed event in Mexican history. The second frame, or way of talking about comics, will relate to the relationship of comics, which are one type of print culture, to other cultural media, and to the cultural influence of US culture. I want to show that comics in Mexican history are not a niche object or product, but a part of a broader cultural mosaic that includes a much larger constellation of media, such as television, film, and radio. Finally, I want to talk about a thematic way of thinking about comic books. How do we analyze comics and the stories they tell? How do we get lessons from these comics that might be historically valuable or culturally useful for us as we study Mexico. I was trained as a literary critic, and comic books are not as easy to analyze thematically as you might expect them to be. It's like my students, oh, this poem is just half a page long. It'll be easy to analyze. And that's not the case. It's often much more difficult to analyze. And I've had the same experience with comics. Oh, it's just a comic. There's a lot of pictures and not a lot of words. I'll be able to analyze this real easy. And I got a rude awakening. So my first frame for understanding Mexican comics is the idea of mass culture. We are all in general familiar with the distinction between so-called high and low culture, or between elite and popular culture. Mass culture is a kind of popular culture that is identified with the 20th century because of its dependence on certain kinds of technologies for its transmission and its ability to reach massive numbers of people. Those technologies are cheap printing, radio, television, film, and now in the 21st century, the internet. The culture of the masses is often trans-regional, breaking down boundaries within a nation. It is also transnational, traveling across national borders. And it can also be transcontinental or transatlantic. Take, for example, the case of Mexican telenovelas, or soap operas, which took the former Soviet Union by storm in the 1990s. In the recent post-communist terrain of Russian and Eastern European television, Mexican telenovelas became extremely popular because the local television industries had little experience and funding to produce such entertaining programs. All that was required was dubbing, and Mexican tales of love and betrayal and passion became hugely impactful far from the shores of Mexico. This is the power of mass culture, to take an entertainment and punch through language and cultural barriers, and bring large numbers of people, different people together to share in one experience. Comics are a type of mass culture, and they brought Mexican together in ways that no other form of print had ever done before in Mexican history. So to substantiate this claim, let me take a step back and talk about what it meant to be a reader in 19th century Mexico. The first fact to keep in mind is that throughout the 1800s, less than 10% of the Mexican population knew how to read. In the middle of the 20th century, as I will show in a few moments, approximately 50% of Mexicans knew how to read. So the tiny number of readers in the 19th century is a huge barrier to having a mass culture experience through the reading of print. But that's not the only barrier. Let's talk about what it meant to buy books and reading material in the 1800s. We know that in the middle of the century, that one book for sale in Mexico City could cost anywhere from 4 to 8 pesos, and a multi-volume work generally costs more than 20 pesos. Excuse me. For a school teacher making 100 or 200 pesos a year, the purchase of a single book could be anywhere between 5 and 10% of his yearly salary. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. 5 and 10% of his yearly salary. What does a school teacher make on average nowadays in Arlington? Maybe $40,000. So 5 or 10% of that, that's an expensive book, people. That's the most expensive coffee table book in the history of books. That's, so in contrast, daily and weekly newspapers and magazines cost 10 to 50 cents per issue and a peso or less for a monthly subscription. This was the kind of print that could be read by huge numbers of people because it was cheap, but it was limited in its reach because of the low literacy rate, as I just said, and also because 19th century newspapers and magazines were very local in nature. They were not universalist in their flavor. While they might share certain national news and international news, Mexico City newspapers were primarily of interest to the inhabitants of Mexico City, and less so to the inhabitants of Puebla, for example, who had their own newspapers. So newspapers tended, and magazines tended to be circumscribed to a particular community. So before I get with comic books again, I want to dwell for a few more moments on the 19th century. The most popular novel in 19th century Mexico and Latin America was a Colombian novel titled Maria by Jorge Isaacs, and it was originally published in 1867. Between this date and 1900, over 40 editions of the novel were published in Latin America and in Europe for distribution in Spanish-speaking countries. An extremely conservative estimate of print runs would tell us that this means that at least 60,000 copies of Maria by Jorge Sachs were in circulation, whereas a more moderate estimate would be at least 100,000 copies between 1867 and 1900. So Maria was read in Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, Venezuela, Cuba, everywhere throughout South America, but it was still limited to a small minority of consumers because of the low literacy rates throughout the continent. For this reason, it's difficult to talk about Maria in terms of mass culture, even though it was transnational. Its popularity was transnational. So when we talk about mass culture and the impact of print, radio, or television, the numbers are much more dramatic, and we have to land in the 20th century in order to start to explore that. So let's get with comics again. Some of you are like, why is he talking about the 1800s? Click here to listen to learn about comic books. Let's get with comics again and talk about why they are why we can call them mass culture in 20th century Mexico. The Mexican literacy rate in 1920 is around 20%. By the end of the 1930s, it's over 40. By 1950, it's over 50%. By 1970, it's well over 75%. In other words, in 50 years, between 1920 and 1970, the literacy rate went from less than a quarter of Mexico's population to over 3/4 of the population. And at the very moment that Mexican literacy begins to grow exponentially and march toward that more than 75% rate, what is the cheapest, most available, and most enticing form of print available to new readers? The comic book, obviously. What are you going to pick if you're a working class Juan or a working class Juana who just learned to read? That newspaper talks about politics and world events, or that colorful comic book about the Mexican Revolution or a superhero. And this is what happened. So let's talk very briefly about pricing of comic books in the, at this peak moment of the 1940s and 1950s. On average, comics in Mexico cost around 10 centavos, 10 centavos, through the mid-1940s, and then it went up by 1950 to about 1 peso. And what does that mean in terms of the real lives of real people? Well, that's 1/3 to 1/4 of the average hourly wage of a worker. So if we think about this in terms of minimum wage, then now we're talking $1 to $2 per comic, if we want to translate that into a context that's understandable to us. Another way of thinking about it is in terms of the price of other things. Newspapers cost essentially the same, but less copies of newspapers were sold than copies of comic books. A movie ticket cost 5 to 10 times the price of a comic book in the 1940s and 1950s. So it really is the cheapest form of entertainment available to consumers at the middle of the century. So when we cross-reference, my script says stay on slide 8, and I just slipped away. So it says stay, really big letters. All right, so when we cross-reference this information about literacy rates with print runs, we soon discover that at mid-century, more Mexicans read comics than any other kind of print. In the 1940s, there were 4 daily comic books that, taken together, had a print run of 500,000 copies, along with 3 comic book weeklies that, taken together, published 1 million copies a week. So remember that on average, every comic was read by 3 or 4 different readers. So when we talk about a print run of 1 million copies a week, in terms of how many times a comic is being read, we're really talking about 4 million separate readings. According to one estimate, taking multiple readers into account, 2 million people read 1 comic a day in the 1940s and 1950s, and another 4 million read 1 comic a week. So these are not just kids, these are adults as well. This is not, and it's not geeks, people, it's normal people. And no offense to any geeks here, I'm a geek, so no offense there, please. These are just average people who are wonderful in their individual ways, but they're just regular people of all ages. If we take into account statistics about population size and the literacy rate, these 6 million readers account for over 80% of the people in Mexico who could read at the middle of the 20th century. So in the middle of the 20th century, 80%, according to one estimate, of the readers were reading comic books either on a daily or weekly basis. More recent statistics show that the enduring power of this readership. In the 1980s, Mexico's most popular Western comic book had a print run of over 1 million copies a week. In the 2000s, hurt by the rise of the internet and the overall decline of comic readership in Mexico, its print run was around 400,000 a week. So the impact of a cultural object through mass culture is much more powerful than before mass culture. And I've tried to show this by talking about the relatively modest readership of print in the 1800s. Furthermore, the impact of Mexican comics is even more massive in the 20th century than what I've already tried to show you, because Mexican comics were exported or licensed and reprinted in Argentina and other Latin American countries, but especially Argentina, which is significant because its literacy rate was at 75% 100 years before Mexico reached 75%. By the end of the 1800s, the literacy rate in Argentina was 75%. It took Mexico another 100 years to basically get to that rate. So when comic books start arriving on the scene in the 1940s, there are many more readers in Argentina, potential readers, than in Mexico. So it's natural, obvious, and natural that comic books from Mexico would travel to Argentina. They were licensed, they were syndicated to be printed down there. So there were more readers in Argentina and its near neighbor Uruguay than in any other Latin American country, which meant more demand for comics, and Mexico was one of the most important providers of comics to these countries. Now I'm allowed to switch slides, according to what the paper says. So the second frame I want to bring to our conversation about comics is the idea of comics as a part of a broader cultural conversation. In other words, comics as a genre of entertainment that has been historically intertwined with other forms of mass media, such as radio, television, and film. We need to see the Mexican comic as a part of an energetic circuit composed of film, radio, television, and cheap print. Cheap print, what do I mean? Pulp novels, which are also extremely inexpensive and available throughout Latin America and in Fiesta markets. If you go to Fiesta supermarkets and look at the little magazine section, you'll see those little Western comics that look like comic books. They're the same size. The size of comic books in Mexico, they're a small size so that people can carry them in their back pocket and carry it with them. It signals the populist nature of the comic, the actual dimensions of the comic. It tells us something about how it circulates and how it moves in culture. And the size of these pulp fictions, these little Western novels that are not comics, identical to the size of the comic books, communicates the same phenomenon. So all of these things are interrelated: film, television, etc. So I want to illustrate this interconnectedness of comics with other types of media by giving you a really concrete example. I'm really excited about this. And I think Dr. Reese is going to be excited about this as well. Calimán. I'm not going to do it loud because there's another presentation next door. But let's meet one of the greatest comic book heroes of modern Mexico, Calimán. Calimán is a beautiful, muscular man of indeterminate ethnicity, although his skin is white. He wears a milk-white costume and turban. He is an oriental figure, but he's ambiguous in terms of ethnicity. He has great speed, extraordinary vision, superhuman stamina and endurance, an extraordinary mind. He can speak to animals. He's a hypnotist. He has ESP. And he belongs to a group of men protected by the Hindu goddess of Kali, and he dedicates his life to the pursuit of justice. The name Calimán comes from the goddess, the Hindu goddess Kali, and the suffix man, inspired by the example of Superman. Both of them have one thing in common: they're both orphans. As a boy, Calimán was raised by Tibetan lamas with secret extraterrestrial knowledge. Calimán's sidekick, the Robin to his Batman, is Solín, an Egyptian youngster descended from the pharaohs. And the ideology of Calimán is that the human mind is limitlessly powerful and influential, as long as it's properly trained and used in a disciplined manner. Calimán also has some pretty groovy 60s values because he believes in nonviolence, patience, and endurance. He's very much a self-help kind of figure. In a way, he is an inspiring role model for people who might come from a disadvantaged background. The reason I want to talk about Calimán is because he illustrates the interconnectedness of so many of Mexico's greatest comics to other forms of mass media. Let's take a moment to review how this works. Calimán began on the radio in 1963 on a station called Radio Cadena Nacional. And his show was the most popular radionovela, which is just a radio program, a radio drama. His show was the most popular radio show in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He was created by two radio announcers, Modesto Vázquez González, who was from Cuba, and Rafael Cuberto Navarro, who's from Mexico. And they created him in 1963, and they had actors performing the different voices. And Calimán has a very distinctive voice, and the show, you can actually listen to it on the internet. They have some episodes online. It begins with the announcer, the voice of Calimán, saying, Calimán. As I said, I want to be respectful of the other event. So I won't try to recreate it. So after his birth on the radio in 1963, Calimán began to appear in comics in 1965 with the assistance of other writers, Jorge Díaz de León and Mario de la Torre. The comic was wildly popular. Its sales in the 1970s were between 1.5 to 3.5 million copies a week. In fact, scholars who interviewed 63 magazine vendors in Mexico City and Cuernavaca found out that Calimán sold 5 more copies weekly, 5 times more issues than its nearest superhero competitor. Its only real competitor was Lágrimas, Risas y Amor, a romance book directed to female readership. And like so many other Mexican characters from comic books, Calimán was a continental phenomenon, appearing for sale across South America, not only in Mexico. And the story of Calimán's jumping from one kind of media to another doesn't end with the leap from radio to comic books. There's also a leap after the comic book to film. So there have been 2 Calimán movies, the first of which was released in 1972. When it appeared, it was the most expensive Mexican movie ever produced. And Mexico had an extraordinary film industry that began in the 1930s. And so this is the most expensive movie made in Mexican history up to that moment. And I just want you to realize that the Mexican film industry was very mature. It's not a beginner's industry. It already had 40 years of existence, almost 40 years of existence when this movie came out. So this movie, the first one, it's one of the campiest movies ever made, in my opinion. I think it's the kind of movie you watch on Mystery Science Theater 3000. And I'm not insulting Mexican filmmakers for this. I'd say the same thing about the Adam West Batman television show, right? It's just a very campy production. And it's enjoyable if you can have a few beers before and you're in an ironical mood. But if you watch it straight, well, I don't think it's possible watching it with a straight face. And one of the best parts of the movie, in my opinion, is at the very beginning, and it relates to this issue of connecting different forms of media together and validating the leap from comic book to film. And Calimán appears in a semi-transparent form against the Far Eastern background. And you hear the voice of the original actor who plays him on the radio saying, essentially, this is Calimán, and I am here to let you all know that I have given permission to Jeff Cooper to perform my role in this movie. He is a good actor. And it says something like that. And so they're not taking any chances with people accepting Jeff Cooper as Calimán, and so Calimán himself must intervene at the beginning of the movie. And it's funny, but I think it's important because it relates to this issue of the interconnectedness of media, which is a very recurrent motif in the history of comic books and popular culture in Mexico. So my argument about the interconnectedness of comics with other forms of media takes me to the topic of the cultural influence that US comics had on Mexican comics, and the ways in which that influence was channeled through a variety of media, such as comics, television, and film. And interesting, I just want to pause and let you know that Mexico is not far behind the United States in the comic book industry. The first modern comic book, if we want to get beyond the idea of caricature, which existed in the 19th century, but the first thing that we would recognize as a comic book emerges in the middle of the 1930s in the United States. It's a comic book digest. It's a magazine that has a section of Superman, a section of Betty Boop, a section of Roy Rogers. It's not a comic book about one character. We call those comic book digests. Well, these comic book digests are the first recognizable modern comics, and they emerge in the middle of the 1930s. And Mexican comic book digests emerge 4 or 5 months later. So Mexicans are producing comic books not far behind the United States. Mexico's not playing catch up to the United States, and it's not always copying the United States. It's got a parallel industry. So I want to talk about the issue of the Western and how we can see cultural influence from the United States through Western comics, through Western television programs, through films. Okay, so in the 1930s, when Mexican comics began to emerge shortly after they emerged in the United States, US cowboys were not a very popular topic. Mexico had its own tradition of rural adventure stories with charros, Mexican vaqueros basically. It was independent, it was parallel. There were bandits, there were stories about bandits, shootouts, tough men. They wore hats, but they were sombreros. They weren't US cowboy hats. So in the 1930s, there really wasn't a lot going on in Mexico with regards to the Western. When Antonio Nariño, a great Mexican artist, went to his editor at the magazine Chamaco to pitch the idea of a comic set in the US Wild West and with white and Indian characters, his editor told him that he was crazy. Why would Mexicans be interested in that? But he let Nariño try it. And the comic he created, Águila Roja, or Red Eagle, became a smash hit, and it started to spawn a series of copies. Águila Negra was one, Águila Solitaria, and then a series of comics called Charro Negro. So beginning in the 1950s, when television began to penetrate Mexican culture, large numbers of US Western television programs, such as The Roy Rogers Show, Half Gun Will Travel, Bonanza, and The Lone Ranger started to become very well known, as in the rest of Latin America. Most of these programs had US comic books that went along with them, and which were also syndicated in Mexico with the same art, but the words translated into Spanish. I think probably one of my favorite parts of the exhibit relates to this, and I've got 2 copies of the same Lone Ranger comic, the US version and the Mexican version. It's the same comic, and they've got them up there together. It's really neat to see them together. So these television programs come in, and they bring comic books with them that are about the same characters. And so US cowboy iconography begins to filter into Mexico and make itself felt in visible ways, blending with more native forms of storytelling. In Mexican comics, we start to see cowboys that look like US gunfighters, as we do in Mexican films. All of this is happening as a circular conversation or dialogue between television, comics, and film. In some cases, Mexican Western comics look like pastiches of US Western comics. They just look like copies. There are no Mexicans in them, a bunch of white people fighting Indians and bandits. No one's dressed like a Mexican, so some comics are pastiches. And the issue of the pastiche is so extreme that sometimes they'll use bylines with US names as the author, as a pseudonym. So instead of Jose Gonzalez as the author, they might put Gary West or Billy Flynn as the author to kind of create the illusion that this is a foreign product, right? But the authors and the artists are all Mexican. So we've got pastiches that try to pose as authentically North American stories. And other times we have Mexican Western comics that are hybrids of US influence and local culture and color. One of Mexico's greatest film directors, Ismael Rodriguez, made a Western called Los Hermanos del Hierro that was released in 1960 and which featured US-style gunfighters alongside Mexican charros or vaqueros. It's a great metaphor for the kind of complex cultural exchange that takes place between the US and Mexico in the modern age. In the 1960s and the 1970s, Italian spaghetti westerns become a part of this process as well, impacting Mexican film. And it's easy to see some connections between the aesthetic of the spaghettis and the most popular Mexican comic of the late 20th century, El Libro Vaquero, or the cowboy book. There is a harshness in both kinds of storytelling, a brutality as well as a similar sense of sensuality and lustfulness in the treatment of women's bodies. So there's a lot of influencing going on, a lot of exchange, a lot of mixing. Sometimes there's copying, trying to make it look like a US product and trying to pass it off as the Lone Ranger, but in Spanish, when all the authors and the artists are Mexican. Other times it's truly a combination of Mexican and US influence with cowboys that are half charro, half US style gunfighter. So the idea of comics as a part of a wider mass culture conversation that takes place on more than one channel, for example, simultaneously in comics, film, and radio, as in the case of Calimán, illustrates how mass culture entertainments cannot be understood in isolation. The study of comics is not the study of a thing, but a network. To understand the popular culture myths of modern Mexico, we must travel the connections between the points of this network rather than select just one node. The final frame or way of looking at comics that I want to propose in closing is thematic. How do we interpret Mexican comics and the stories they tell? Do they have one point of view? Is there a bullet list of themes that we can point to and to define a particular theme or set of themes? It is here where I have struggled the most over the past year, as I've begun to look for ways to talk about serialized pulp fiction and comics in an analytical way. The problem is that comics are a form of serialized fiction rather than standalone works of literature. Yes, we can analyze one comic and try to extrapolate themes, but when it comes to relating these conclusions to broader historical questions, the answers are relatively meaningless. One comic does not tell the story about what comics as a genre are about in a particular time and place. In fact, one comic doesn't even tell the story of what that one comic is about and why it is about that particular theme or has a particular message. So comics are a form of serialized literature that is highly conventional and ritualized. The plot structure of a comic and its characters are usually not the invention of an individual scriptwriter or artists, or even a group of writers. Rather, it is the product of a relatively impersonal narrative and commercial tradition that grows cumulatively over time, aggregating patterns as it goes along and recombining them over and over again. This becomes obvious as you read many comics in a given series, such as love story comics or Mexican westerns or comics about the immigrant experience in the contemporary moment. They are extremely repetitive. The characters seem the same, even when they have different names. The plots are formulaic and repetitive. To approach these comics through the lens of allegory, which argues that a given plot represents a given reality, is to misread them. Because the plots of comics are not an individualist invention or a creation tied to a given historical moment. They're inherited, and they're highly conventional and artificial. The plots of comics are a collective arrangement created by an industry. They are an inherited set of tools and mechanisms for eliciting audience response. Many of the most popular comics in Mexico don't even have a single author. They are pseudonymous or collective collaborations. One metaphor we may use to talk about the issue are the comics starring the famous Mexican wrestler El Santo. These comics were built with a series of photographs and are called photo novels. The creator of El Santo, Jose Cruz, and his collaborators frequently reused the same photograph cutouts of their hero in different stories. They did not see each comic as an individual invention, but as a restaging and recombination of poses that had been used before in many other comics. They didn't so much write a new story for a new issue as recombine the pictures in a different way to create a different story. And I like this anecdote just because I think it's a metaphor for the broader point I'm trying to make. So my point is that to read comics as mass literature and in a meaningfully analytical way, we need to read them collectively, not individually. Rather than focusing on one story or one work, we need to identify the formula that is applied across dozens or hundreds of different issues of the same comic. I'm very interested in a libro vaquero and trying to make arguments about a libro vaquero, a cowboy comic. There are nearly 2,000 issues out there. It's enough to make anyone maybe switch topics. A famous Russian formalist critic, Vladimir Prop, took this very approach to the study of folk tales and produced a groundbreaking work named Morphology of the Folk Tale that was originally published in 1928. Rather than reading for a theme in a loose way in an individual folk tale, Prop tried to map out the structures, sequencing, and plotting of folk tales, and he discerned a series of repeatable structures in folk tales. Any full accounting of the meaning of Mexican comics must, in my view, make such a structuralist analysis a part of how we talk about their meaning. It's not the only way to frame the meaning of Mexican comics, but it should be there as a part of the inquiry into the meaning of any comic book series. So I'd like to wrap up by illustrating this final point by talking some more about El Libro Vaquero, or the cowboy book that I mentioned a few minutes ago. El Libro Vaquero was created in 1978 and is arguably the most widely distributed and popular comic book in Mexico until the 2000s, when all comic book sales began to dip. During its heyday in the 1980s, over 1 million copies of El Libro Vaquero were published a week, whereas in recent years, its circulation has dipped to 400,000 copies a week. Whether we're talking about 50 million copies circulating per year or 12 million, we probably need to double or triple either number to account for the number of readers who read each title, since, as I said before, each comic book is read on average by 4 separate people. The comic poses as a foreign North American product by erasing the presence of Mexico and Mexicans from its pages and by using Anglo-American bylines for its scripts. In particular, the most important pseudonym the publishers have used throughout the years has been Billy Flynn. This name became so well known that a rival comic book company once published a competing Western called El Vaquero de Billy Flint, or the Billy Flint stories, the Billy Flint Western. Other US-sounding pseudonyms currently in use include Gary West, Robin Parker, and Arthur Fable. And these are just some of the Billy Flynn bylines that were used in the 1980s. Billy Flynn is not very popular nowadays. My students are doing some research on Mexican comic books, and they have current comic books with them in class. And we looked through and we couldn't find Billy Flynn. But in the 1980s and 1990s, he was the man. So let's talk a little bit about the repeating patterns. And I picked stories of interethnic conflicts between Indians and white cowboys. There are 2 types of stories in El Libro Vaquero. We've got stories that are the gunfighter stories set in towns, basically, and then we have the stories that have to do with cultural contact between Indians and Anglo-American settlers. Very rarely, almost never, do we see Mexicans as a part of the story. Sometimes we see African Americans, and sometimes we see, I have a comic with some Chinese characters in it. It's very rare for there to be Mexican characters. So I picked that, and I started to look at this across multiple issues to try to discern patterns. So I want to share some of what I found. The first thing I found was that most of these stories about cultural contact have to do with rape or seduction of white women. So stories about interethnic contact are mediated by the presence of the body of a woman. And that makes sense because El Libro Vaquero is defined by being a story that is about macho men fighting over women, essentially. Every issue is about that in some form or fashion. The creator of El Libro Vaquero said, I grew up reading US comic books syndicated in Mexico. They were very dry. Someone robbed a horse. Red Ryder had to go and figure out and trap the bandit and put him in jail. And there's no passion. There's no sabor. There's no flavor. And so he said, I wanted to create a Western comic that had a little bit of soul. And he called it Western a la Mexicana, a Mexican-style Western with passion. And so every issue of El Libro Vaquero has a love story or sensual love story as a part of the tale. So when we're talking about interethnic conflict, captivity narratives are going to be central, and the struggle to who controls the woman's body. So what are some of the other things that I've noticed? Well, let's talk about setting. The same settings recur. We have the road, which is a space of transit, which is subject to attack, violation, and perhaps escape. We have the homestead inhabited by whites, always attacked. It is never a safe haven. A campsite in the woods that is always attacked by white outlaws and is often the site of rape. We have the tribal grounds of the American Indians, which contains a sexualized domestic sphere inside of the teepees, as well as a ritualized public area in which a lone white man is usually forced to fight for his life with another Indian or for the life of a captive white woman. We have the open fields near the Indian encampment, which is always the place where the natives go to practice free love. Don't ask me why. We have a small pond or a riverfront space where Indian women splash around naked like nymphs, and sometimes the interior of a fort in which members of the U.S. cavalry deliberate about peacekeeping on the frontier. We see this over and over again in all the comics, and we see the same characters over and over again. We see the good cowboy, the lustful outlaw, the pioneer father, pioneer young woman, the noble Indian chief, the noble warrior, the malevolent Indian, the sensual Indian woman, the blue jacket officer, and I can tell you what's going to happen to every single one of them before I get past the third page, because it's always the same thing. And so this is the kind of work that we need to do when we analyze Mexican comics. And what have I found in a tentative way, just to wrap up? The two fundamental plots of the interethnic conflict that I examined in these comics is it's always interracial love between whites and Indians, or the horror of racial conflict. In the first, a white man or a white woman overcomes racial prejudice and goes native. In the second grouping, which might also include interracial love as a part of the plot, the emphasis is less on romance and more on the tragic dimension of racial hatred. One type of story is foundational, resulting in the creation of a new mestizo identity embodied in a new interracial family or community. The other presents a less rosy picture of cultural contact and questions the feasibility of joining whites with Indians. In either case, I could say that El Libro Vaquero claims racial boundaries as fundamental to the frontier experience. On the one hand, from a utopian point of view, they're an opportunity to transgress and reformulate identity, while the obverse of the formulation is a difficulty in healing the wound of that transgression, in overcoming figurative, physical, or symbolic trauma that the transgression of racial crossing has caused. In other words, there is one strand in El Libro Vaquero that says racial mixing is good and desirable. There is another strand that sees race relations as something that cannot be overcome. So you can't really generalize about El Libro Vaquero having one thesis about a particular theme. There are different theses that are in conflict with one another. But this only would apply to the period in which these comics were published. And the ones that I looked at were from the 1980s. And so in order to really make an argument about this and generalize in a contextual way, I need to be able to do the same for the 90s and the 2000s. Is there a difference? And how does that difference reflect what's happening in Mexico culturally and politically? These cultural narratives are bigger than an individual comic book or an individual comic book series. They relate to film, they relate to TV, they relate to debates in Mexican society, they relate to what's happening in politics. And so when things change in the culture, this filters down into the comics. And when you want to make an argument about a comic like El Libro Vaquero, you need to do this read across multiple issues, but you also need to compare and contrast with different periods. Because when you've got this comic in existence now for over 30 years, it's not the same thing from decade to decade. So in closing, I just want to say that there's a lot more to say, but I will not say it. And I also want to take a moment to say that I forgot to thank Phi Kappa Phi for co-sponsoring this talk. I had it written on my front page, but for some reason I didn't say it. And so I appreciate the members of that organization for supporting this talk and being interested in helping to make this happen. So I really appreciate that, and thank you for your time.
Hey Chris, I have a question. From a linguistic perspective, first of all, I thought it was extremely interesting. From a linguistic perspective, when they portray members of indigenous communities in Latin America and Mexico, do they change the way they talk? Do they speak in infinitives?
Yes, they do speak in infinitives. Yes, let me go back.
Because I saw one there.
Callar, tu ser de Apaches. So yes, they drop a lot of articles and they speak in infinitives. When Chinese people are depicted, they replace the R's with the L's. As we know, in Hispanic culture, that is one of the more stereotypical ways that people in the Spanish-speaking world make fun of how Asian people speak. And they do that with Asian characters in all comics. And Indians, it's required for them to speak in infinitives. It's required, yes. And they also, the way they speak and some of the references in their language makes me think that Karl May, the famous Western author, might have been the inspiration for some of the speech of the Indians. I believe Karl May was German, if I remember correctly. Someone can correct me about that later.
Karl May. Yeah.
Karl May.
Yes.
I don't even know how to pronounce his name.
Right.
But was he German, Ben?
Yes, he was, and he was just one of many German authors, but the most popular one in the 19th.
I have my hypothesis is that his novels, which are from the 1920s and 1930s,
Right.
might have been very well read in Mexico. I haven't been able to confirm this. Some of the speech of the Indians, for me, tracks with what appears in his novels, but I haven't looked into that yet. Yeah.
Just talking about the speech, the representation of speech. In France, you have a colonial speech, and the colonial officers and army was taught how to speak to the colonized. And then the colonized had a reputation for not being able to speak properly. But there was literally a grammar book, how to speak to one of your colonized. And it was infinitive.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's called Petit Nègre. And so the justification was that they couldn't speak well, but the officer didn't speak them proper French. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like a vicious circle. Mm-hmm. Look, they're too stupid to speak properly, but we teach them how to speak like this.
I don't know if all of you heard that, but what Tony Sol was saying was that in the French colonial situation, there was a school of thought where people were taught to teach the colonized in using infinitive.
It's an army manual.
Part of an army manual. So that's really fascinating. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah.
My question has to do with Kaliman, because like most of the superheroes in America are always American. They're usually, I mean, I can't think of an example, and there probably is one, but I can't think of one off the top of my head where it's somebody of indeterminate, vague, you know.
Oriental.
Yeah.
Or Shazam or something.
But I'm thinking maybe the only thing I can think of is like Almighty Isis, which was popular when I was a kid. That was a television series, but she was still American. She was just being inhabited by the Egyptian.
So what's Mexican about Kaliman? That's a great
right,
question.
and so I'm wondering, that just seems very odd to me that they would have a superhero that's not Mexican.
Sure. Well, that's a great question, and the same question applies to a libro vaquero. What's Mexican about a libro vaquero when all the characters are white or Indian and black and sometimes...
Right, and I was thinking the same thing when you were talking about that.
So this is what's so tricky about trying to do allegorical readings, right? Oftentimes, it's just not a good way to read these comics, but one famous critic, Harold Hines, proposes the following reading of Kaliman. He says that Kaliman, a lot of the adventures of Kaliman take place in exotic locales, oriental, quotation marks, oriental locales. And he is a product of this primitive, kind of primitive, but also not in a pejorative way, in a kind of mystical, exotic, and powerful way. He's a product of a pre-modern world, a world that exists outside of modernity. And one of his greatest foes is La Araña Negra, the black spider. And the black spider usually dresses in suits, wears a mask, and he's got a bunch of henchmen that are like men in black. And Harold Hines argues that there's this whole sense of La Araña Negra as a kind of syndicate associated with urbanity, with urban space, with capitalism, with people who dress a certain way. It kind of maps out a world that is urban, capitalistic, modernizing, etc. And Calimán is this throwback to a more exotic time. He comes from this oriental place. He's got these special powers. They're not tied to institutional networks of influence of the city, so to speak, or of capitalism. And so therefore, his argument is that, that Calimán is tapping into a distrust that the Mexican people have toward the urban condition and modernization. And this is persuasive to some degree if we think about what's happening in the 1960s with telenovelas, because the most popular, when telenovelas emerge in the late 1960s and really the beginning of the 1970s, which is this moment, Calimán moment, the most popular story is the story of the campesina, the peasant girl who goes from the countryside to the city. And this is throughout all of Latin America. Goes from the countryside to the city and has to learn how to negotiate her identity in this new urban environment. It's not a traditional setting anymore, and she needs to figure out how to survive. And she ultimately becomes successful, middle class. There's a love story, there's all kinds of stuff that happens. And so many telenovelas in the late 1960s and the first half of the 1970s told the same story over and over again. And the reason is because we've got this this demographic shift towards cities and a real passion and interest on the part of consumers to explore this question of how do we go from a traditional setting to a more urban capitalistic setting. And so if you take that framework and think about what Harold Hines says, then I think you could be somewhat persuaded by what he says. And maybe Calimán is a symbol of Mexicanness in a very, in a paradoxical way. This Oriental figure is a symbol of traditional Mexicanness in a very indirect way.
Like hearkening back to the Mayan or Aztec world?
You could talk about it in that way, or simply a nostalgia for some vanished Arcadia that no longer exists and that represents traditional values. But I think that there's another way of reading Calimán, which has to do with the whole self-help narrative that I alluded to in my presentation. And in terms of a libro vaquero, what's Mexican about a libro vaquero when they're all white people and Indians? Well, so many of those stories, the interethnic conflict ones, most of them are about border crossing, about crossing between ethnicities, about cultural contact, about people. It's about the immigrant experience. Now, they might be Swedish, they might be whites immigrating to Indian lands, but we've got this notion of the border crossing. And so most critics, 3 or 4 that I know of, and I agree with them, El Libro Vaquero is about immigration, and highly mediated, it's presented in a very indirect way. Right. And we've got, for example, there's a comic that in my collection where some corrupt whites hire some evil Indians to clear out some pioneers from some land so that they can buy up all the land. And the Indians are hiding in the bushes watching this log cabin with Swedish shores. They're Scandinavian immigrants in there, and let's go and kill them. And one of the Indians says to the others, well, they're foreigners, they shouldn't be here. And they go and they massacre and kill everybody. And so there's a way in which this kind of narrative about crossing borders, trying to settle in a new place, being faced with a new cultural environment, different groups. You've got runaway slaves, you've got a crazy Chinese princess crossing over, you've got white people, you've got good whites, you've got bad whites, you've got the military, the whites in uniform, and you're trying to survive, and there's just you and your family, your daughters. How do you manage this space? And I think it's a very persuasive reading of El Libro Vaquero. And so I would say that that's what's Mexican about El Libro Vaquero. I would argue that with confidence. With regards to Calimán, I'm not much of an expert on Calimán, but I've read about him, and I've anticipated this question, and because it's interesting to me as well. And I think there's something to that, I think. And maybe others here who maybe know about Calimán might want to opine on it as well. So, yeah, great question.
Thanks, Chris.
Wow.
You know, by the way, the start of your question saying that all superheroes were American, Superman, wasn't he from another planet, Krypton?
That is true.
And Shazam was
Shazam was
Arabian,
Arabic.
Arabic?
I never remember Shazam.
Oh,
Thanks.
Superman
in the Graham Greene's Power of the Glory, there were comics on Lives of the Saints, and I just wondered how prevalent are religious themed comics and whether or not the church is in any way involved.
They're hugely, hugely important, and in the exhibit you will see some beautiful comics about La Virgen de Guadalupe. You have to go see the exhibit. You don't have to do it today. I'll give you a pass if you like these people, they're leaving. But you have to come back and you have to go to the exhibit, because I didn't talk about a lot of the comics in the exhibit. I took a different course. Yes, comics have been used by different groups in Mexico to promote certain ideologies. The Mexican state funded comic books to promote nationalism. And so oftentimes, and a lot of these comics are on display, we have comics about the Mexican Revolution, Mexican War of Independence, the Conquest, and it's a way for the Mexican state to promote literacy among cultural literacy, but in the sense of having nationalist awareness and pride as a citizen, as a Mexican citizen. So that's a really big strain in the history, a big thread in the history of Mexican comic books. More conservative groups and more radical groups, communist groups and more conservative Catholic groups, you also use comic books. And this happened the same in the United States, where they would put out comic books as a way to teach kids and readers and adults, because comics were read by everybody, about their particular ideology and promote it, and promote that group identity against a different group identity. And so comics are not just about entertainment, they're about cultural agendas in Mexico. And I think you get a sense of that through this exhibit. You really see how comic books are not just fun reading, leisure time reading. They're also a very serious vehicle for promoting agendas. And this happens throughout the history of Mexico. The Mexican history in the 20th century.
I think that's all the time we have
Yeah.
for questions, but I would like to thank you, Dr. Conway, for your remarks today.
And thank all of you.